Hello, this is Professor Young, and we are back for part 2 of our look at the skeletal system. This section of the PowerPoint really deals with looking at the physiology that is involved with maintaining bone, which is broken down into two basic parts. Bone formation, which we know are done by our osteoblast cells. So we're looking at these guys right here. That's this guy here. And then our bone reabsorption, or the breaking down of that uh, hydroxyapatite or that calcium phosphate matrix, which we know is done by osteoclasts, which are these guys over here. And so let's go ahead and start looking at this process and see if we can make sense of what is happening and just how complicated bone formation is, and not only how complicated of a negative feedback system that this is, but also the intricacy that we see with how what is happening in our skeletal system also relates to what is happening elsewhere within the body and other systems. So here is a slide that kind of walks us through this process of bone remodeling. This here is a negative feedback system that is going to ultimately regulate osteoblast activity. So we are looking at what is the process that is regulating the development of more bone, usually due to an excess of calcium within our blood, what we would define as the blood calcium level. And so to start this process, we have our chemoreceptors that are within the blood. These are actually nerve endings or nerves that will tie into or innervate with arterioles that specifically monitor blood calcium levels as the blood is circulating through the body. And if these blood calcium levels, or I'm sorry, if these blood calcium receptors detect a drop in blood calcium levels, and that's what you're seeing right here. Right, so our chemoreceptors have detected a drop in blood calcium levels, then a signal is sent. Remember, these chemoreceptors are attached to a nerve, and so these nerves will then send a signal to the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is located within the center part of the brain. So you have your corpus callosum, for those that have taken psychology. That is right in the center of the brain. Just below that you have the thalamus, and just below that you have the hypothalamus. And so that hypothalamus is there it's really an endocrine gland. And it's an endocrine gland that is going to regulate another gland that we define as the pituitary gland. And so the way that the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland is through the release of hormones. So you can see here, right, kind of backing up into this area here, right, these chemoreceptors, which are specialized nerves, and their nerve endings come into the blood vessels. And so these chemoreceptors detect a drop or a decrease in blood calcium levels. they send off action potentials to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus then goes ahead and releases a hormone. And that hormone is the thyroid releasing hormone, or what we call TRH. Thyroid releasing hormone then travels down to the pituitary gland. So as we know from lab, the pituitary gland sits just inferiorly to the hypothalamus. And so the thyroid releasing hormone is going to stimulate the pituitary gland to release yet another hormone. And that hormone is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And so once again, TRH, secreted from the hypothalamus, stimulates the pituitary gland to release TSH, thyroid releasing hormone. And in doing so, there's actually a typo in here. I apologize. I just found it. In doing so, the thyroid stimulating hormone does not stimulate the pituitary gland. Instead, it triggers or stimulates the thyroid gland. So this is actually the thyroid gland. I apologize for my my slow third grade handwriting here. There we go. All right, and so the thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. Now, in the thyroid gland, we have these follicles, and surrounding these follicles are cuboidal cells. And these cuboidal cells are what we call follicular cells, all right, or F cells. In between these follicles, these round circular areas that are lined with simple cuboidal cells that we call follicular cells, are another type of cell called parafollicular cells. So you got to kind of imagine, right, if you would. I'm going to try to draw this. You've got a follicle here. You have another follicle here. You have another follicle here. Right. And then in between my follicles, we have smaller follicles. So we've got these follicles that are here in between the follicles. Well, these cells right there that are in between the follicles, right, these cells right here that are in between the follicles, so these are the follicles, the cells that are in between the follicles are what we define as being parafollicular cells. The other name for parafollicular cells are C cells. And we call them C cells because of what they secrete. C cells secrete another hormone that is called calcitonin. All right. So these cells that are in between the follicles that make up the thyroid, known as parafollicular cells, secrete a hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin is then secreted and travels through the blood vessels until it reaches the bone. And when it reaches the bone, it stimulates those osteoprogenitor cells, which are true bone cells, to undergo a process of cellular differentiation. In other words, the osteoprogenitor cells, these stem cells, are going to become specialized bone cells. And the type of specialized bone cells that they become are osteoblasts. And from there, osteoblasts can go ahead and begin to reabsorb the calcium that is elevating blood calcium levels. It's going to pull that calcium from within the blood and pull it into the bone to go ahead and create new bone matrix. It's going to harden that ground substance that is surrounding the osteons, and as we will find out and discover, actually makes up the osteons. And so those circumferential lamellae that we were looking at in lab, right, they're ossified over, and they're ossified using these same processes. Remember, that's where the lacuna are. Inside of the lacuna is where we find osteoblasts. And we'll talk about how those osteoblasts then become osteocytes. In fact, why don't we do that now? We'll go ahead and we'll take a few minutes to let this digest and talk about that. So these osteoblasts that are now triggered begin to throw out new calcified matrix. It's absorbing this calcium in, it's binding it to phosphate, it's creating the hydroxyapatite or the calcium phosphate, it's hardening that bone matrix. Right? And it's doing this in a way that it's surrounding itself. It's kind of like you're motivated, and so you decide you're going to mop the kitchen floor. And so you grab your trusty mop, you clear off the floor, you prepare it for mopping. And you do. You begin to mop, and you mop, and you mop, and you mop. And before you know it, you've mopped yourself into the center of the kitchen. You have no place to go. You're surrounded. You can't step anywhere, or you're going to step on this newly mopped floor that you just spent all this time on. That is what your osteoblast does. It basically mops itself into the center. It can't go anywhere else. There's no more room for new bone. And at that point in time, osteoblasts differentiate and become osteocytes. As I mentioned, this is a complex process, right, which is why I created this little flowchart for you to go ahead and utilize. Now, this is just how we build new bone. But what about the process of bone reabsorption, where we actually break down the bone? And so to understand that, we have yet another flowchart. And this flowchart kind of looks like the other flowchart. But there are some key differences. First thing, chemoreceptors, right, that are actually in the parathyroid, and these chemoreceptors have a name, calcium sensing receptors. Right? They are located in the parathyroid. Now remember, on this slide, right, these chemoreceptors were located within the blood vessels. These were nerves that were innervating the blood vessels. On this slide, right, when we're looking at the breaking down of bone, the calcium sensing receptors, these chemoreceptors, are actually located in the parathyroid. And if you remember from lab, the parathyroid is located on the posterior side of the thyroid. And so these calcium sensing receptors within the parathyroid detect an increase in blood calcium levels. Right? So now we've got, it detects a decrease, detects a decrease in blood calcium levels. I'll have this fixed when I post this for you guys. That is my mistake. And so this arrow is actually facing down like this. So this is a decrease in blood calcium levels. Right? And that decrease in blood calcium levels stimulates a type of cell that's found within the parathyroid called chief cells. And so the chief cells, this is a cell that is within the parathyroid, is responsible for the release of parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone travels through the blood to the bone, where it stimulates the activation of osteoclasts. Now remember, osteoclasts are not a part of the bone lineage. It's not part of the bone family. These osteoclasts are macrophages. They're part of a type of cell family or cell lineage that breaks things down. And so these osteoclasts are going to initiate the process of bone reabsorption, where we break bone down. And in order to begin this process, they need to secrete an enzyme, and that enzyme is called acid phosphatase. Now, acid phosphatase is found in bone, but it's also found in the liver. It's also found in the spleen. Can also be located in the prostate. And it's found in blood. And its main function in blood is pH balance, right? Regulating pH. But also within the liver and the spleen and the prostate, acid phosphatase is lowering pH to be able to go ahead and release this organic phosphate, separating it from something else. Basically, acid phosphatase is an enzyme that is doing the opposite of phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is a process of adding the phosphate group on, whereas acid phosphatase is removing a phosphate group from something. In the case of our skeletal system, acid phosphatase is releasing the phosphate from hydroxyapatite. It's releasing the phosphate from the calcium phosphate. Now, when it does that, both the calcium, which is now free, and the phosphate group, which is now free, are absorbed into the bloodstream and can now circulate within the blood. The phosphate can regulate pH, acting as a buffer, and the calcium can go into storage someplace else. It can help to maintain blood calcium levels within the cardiovascular system. It can be stored within the heart, any number of things. It can be absorbed by muscle, right? And we'll talk about that in the next chapter about why that is important. As it's breaking down that hydroxyapatite, as it's breaking down that calcium phosphate, remember those two terms mean the same thing. It's creating a little pit. It's creating a little depression underneath of where the osteoclast or the osteoclast is located. And that pit, that depression, is what we call the pit of reabsorption. The pit of reabsorption, because this is where reabsorption is taking place, where we're splitting the calcium phosphate into calcium and phosphate. So you're lowering the pH. You're dropping the pH. You're making this environment more acidic, which drives breaking down more calcium phosphate. But, and it's a big but, as we drop the pH, as osteoclast releases acid phosphatase, you lower the pH, which stimulates the release of that guy right here, osteocalcin. Now, osteocalcin is important. It's critical. It's monumental. It is negative feedback gold. This is what drives everything. And ironically, osteocalcin is not released from osteoclasts, but instead, osteocalcin is released from osteoblasts. So think about this. Osteoclasts are secreting acid phosphatase, reabsorbing the calcium, releasing the phosphate, lowering the pH, which triggers osteoblasts, independent of calcitonin, independent of calcitonin. These osteoclasts are stimulating osteoblasts to go ahead and release osteocalcin. Now, what is osteocalcin doing? Okay, sit tight for this. Adjust yourself, get ready. This is where I'm going to control my excitement because this is where the magic is happening. Check this out. Osteoclast, right? They're engaged with bone remodeling. They're reabsorbing the bone. But at the same time, because of the lower pH, they're stimulating osteoblasts through the release of osteocalcin. Remember in the beginning of the semester when I said that the only thing that guarantees you are alive in the next second is the maintaining of homeostasis. That is the only thing that guarantees you are alive in the next second. Think about what don't even think about osteocalcin right now. Think about what is happening when bone is being remodeled and osteoblasts are adding to bone. You've got changes in muscle. You have changes in cardiovascular. You have changes in hormone levels, especially during puberty, with bone lengthening, which we haven't even gotten into yet. You got all of these changes happening, and all of those changes means that you are stressing homeostasis. Dynamic equilibrium is being pushed to its boundaries. You're 1 second away from death because of a loss of homeostasis. Your body is in a constant state of flux. And the only thing that is maintaining that balance of homeostasis is this guy right here. Osteocalcin. What does osteocalcin do? Well, its release is stimulated from a drop of pH caused by osteoclast releasing acid phosphatase, breaking down bone. That stimulates osteoblasts to go ahead and release the osteocalcin. Osteocalcin can then basically self-modify or self-activate osteoblasts to begin the process of laying down new bone. But osteocalcin is also regulating the pancreas. And not just anything within the pancreas, beta cells within a structure that we call the pancreatic islet. Pancreatic islet is where beta cells live, and beta cells release insulin. Insulin allows cells to absorb glucose, and as we know from chapter 3, glucose is key to cellular respiration. Osteocalcin allows the body to respond to a loss of homeostasis due to bone development and growth and maturity by stimulating cell respiration to create ATP to allow for metabolism to catch up to growth. But that's not it. That's not all. Osteocalcin in males stimulate Leydig cells. Leydig cells are cells found within the testes. They respond also to luteinizing hormone, LH. With the triggering of the Leydig cells, you are triggering testosterone to be released. Why is that important? Because testosterone is going to drive muscle development to allow for the muscles to keep pace with the rate of repair found within the bones. Otherwise, if you've got your bone repairing and remodeling and growing and developing and lengthening, and your muscles are not, you're going to tear your muscle. That's not good. Leydig cells will also drive vitamin D production. Vitamin D production is needed for the stimulation of osteoblasts. Osteocalcin also stimulates the development of neural networking, allowing your neurons to create new pathways, new connections, new neural stimuli between neurons to keep up with the rate of growth and development. See, when we remodel the skeletal system, it's not just a remodeling of the skeletal system, it's a remodeling of the entire body. Let that sink in. When we remodel the skeletal system, we're not just remodeling that, we are affecting change systemically. If we just took care of the skeletal system and we ignored everything else, your body would fall from homeostasis. you would enter into a state of disease. And that is what we see happening with individuals who have abnormally low levels of osteocalcin. See, people that are lacking osteocalcin show signs of insulin intolerance. Type 2 diabetes is what we define as insulin intolerance. People that have diets high in fat, what we define as being HFDs, high fat diets. The high levels of triglycerides decreases the release of osteocalcin from osteoblasts. And that leads to insulin resistance. Your diet impacts your skeletal system. Your skeletal system impacts your endocrine system, your reproductive system, your cardiovascular system, your nervous system, your skeletal system, your muscular system. A diet high in fat alters the ability for osteoblasts to release osteocalcin. Which means, very possibly, you can also then have more osteoclast activity than osteoblast activity. In other words, you can break your bone down at a faster rate than what you may possibly be able to remodel it because you're inhibiting the release of osteocalcin. Take it a step further. Your ability to produce osteocalcin was partially determined during your grandmother's pregnancy with your mother. 3 generations ago, your ability to secrete osteocalcin was imprinted on the egg that was in the fetus that would have been your mother, carried by your grandmother. Your health today was, in a sense, predetermined when your grandmother was pregnant with your mother. Let that sink in. If your grandmother was vitamin D deficient during her pregnancy with your mother, she was lacking the needed vitamins to stimulate osteocalcin in your mother's developing skeletal system during fetal development. And that osteocalcin would have stimulated beta cells during the formation of fetal development. So your mother's health was impacted by your grandmother, and your overall ability to produce osteocalcin was impacted by your grandmother's prenatal health. There's a lot of talk about our healthcare system. When you think about access to prenatal health care in America, when you talk about accessibility to see a doctor, when you talk about socioeconomic divisions, when you talk about generational poverty, when you talk about racial division, and who is most affected and impacted by generational poverty, by a lack of accessible health care, by the lack of health insurance. We're talking about our minority communities. We're talking about our black and brown brothers and sisters. And when you look at the rate of insulin resistance, when you look at the rate of diabetes, when you look at the rate of high blood pressure, when you look at the rate of high fat diets, when you look at the rate of atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, when you look at the rate of coronary disease and obesity, we see it in our populations that are most impacted by low socioeconomic attainment, by limited access to affordable health care, and are limited by health insurance. Our healthcare system is racially dividing who can have access, and it's having long-term impacts on our society. You're talking about a 3-generation cycle. You now, if you are a female, need to make sure that you have access to adequate prenatal health care when you are pregnant, because you're impacting the health of your developing fetus, and you're impacting, if that is a female, the eggs that are developing in her. Your health, your prenatal health, will have an impact 2 generations later after you. That is why this is such a large issue. That's why this is a basic right. That's why we need to stand up and fight for equal access to clinics, to health care, and to health insurance. And males have equal impacts as well due to a lack of osteocalcin. Their sperm can be deformed. The genetics that the sperm are carrying can also have implications of not being able to produce osteocalcin appropriately. So this is a big issue. This is a big deal. Now, I know I said I was going to try to keep these videos to about 20 minutes. I'm approaching 40 minutes on this one because this is such an important concept for you all to get and grasp and understand, especially those of you going into allied health and nursing. Real quick, I'm going to draw your attention to these 2 slides here. This shows you picture-wise the negative feedback balance that needs to take place in order to stabilize blood calcium levels with the rate of bone development and bone reabsorption. Right. This also shows you the same thing. Right. And then these last 2 slides here, before we end, These last two slides right here, last three, something like that, kind of give you a breakdown on what are the factors that influence bone metabolism. And so you're looking at the minerals and the vitamins there. And here, these are the hormones that are also involved. We've talked about some of these hormones, thyroid hormones, especially calcitonin. We've talked about insulin a little bit, sex hormones, parathyroid hormone, calcitonin we've talked about. We did not talk much about HGH or IGFs. Um, you've got a description there. Kind of just be aware of them. I can ask you on the exam some questions about that. And then something we'll get into a little bit later in the next video, and that is the impact of aging and exercise on all of this. And so we will touch on that a little bit. I will say for right now, when you go back to, I'm going to kind of back up a few slides here. When you come back to this slide here and we look at the role of the thyroid, remember in females that are undergoing menopause, their thyroid shuts down, slows down. Um, it's what we call hypothyroidism. And in doing so, their ability to release calcitonin decreases as well. And when that ability decreases, keep in mind, calcitonin stimulates osteoblasts to begin to repair that bone. If you're not secreting enough calcitonin because your thyroid is slowing down because of menopause, your bones begin to, your osteoclasts begin to outpace your osteoblasts. And you develop a condition known as osteoporosis, where you lose calcium within the bone. Right? And so this does have implications, especially as we age. And exercise can really thwart that off. But I don't want to go on with that much more than what I already have. It's something else to consider and think about when we look at um, just how complicated um, homeostatic mechanisms can be within a system that seems so straightforward and easy. So, with that said, I'm going to leave you to ponder this. There's going to be some questions that'll be asked of you within the video, and at the end of the video here. Um, if you have any questions, please stop by my office during my office hours. I'm still on campus. Um, Reach out to me via email, Canvas message, whatever you need. But please take the time to make sure that you're reviewing this. And with that, um, I wish you continued success, and always know that I am here to help and support you so that you can be successful. That is always my number one goal and concern, is your success. So let me help you.